So thank you again, everybody, for joining us for something like the 30th version of Planetarium Online. Krista, who's in the chat, did the very first one of these back in April, and we've been doing them every week since then on various astronomical topics of interest. And so our program today is going to be tying into the season. We're going to be exploring Halloween and talking about the astronomical origins of Halloween. So we're going to be going ahead and going out to look at the nighttime sky, where all astronomy has its roots, and then exploring some of the traditions that have led to Halloween. Okay, I'm just checking my video. I had to refresh my screen. It's one of the great things, but scary things about doing Facebook Live is that sometimes your screen will not update on a regular basis. So one hopes you can all see me, and in a moment you'll be seeing the nighttime sky. So again, thank you for joining us. If you have astronomy questions, Krista is there in the chat to answer your astronomy questions. Our show will last about a half an hour, and when it's over, we'll leave a few minutes for questions afterwards as well. Again, we have a donate button. If you wanted to support us, that purple donate button is the one true way to show your support for our programming here. And if you wanted to come down and join us, Liberty Science Center is now open Thursdays through Sundays, and we have planetarium shows every hour that we're open during that time. We'll be using the same planetarium software that we use in the Big Dome on your home screen. It's called Digistar. It was developed by Evans and Sutherland, and from the time of the closure onwards, they were great in terms of letting us use this software for our online programming as well. So that being said, let's go ahead and go out to where all astronomy does have its origins, going out to see the sky you'd see on Halloween night. Halloween is a week from Saturday, so Saturday the 31st, which this year only, by the way, is the last day of daylight saving time. It switches over on Sunday morning. So you're going to fall back Sunday, the day after Halloween. When I was a kid, I thought that it was really great that it got dark before Halloween. They went off daylight saving time right before Halloween until 2005, and I thought that was done on purpose so we kids would have really great dark conditions to go trick-or-treating in. But that wasn't actually the case at all. In 2005, they changed daylight saving time to end after October, and it was to ensure that there was some light, apparently, as folks went around trick-or-treating. So remember to fall back the day after Halloween. Here we are, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun doesn't go down to about 6 or so, so let's go into the evening sky that you'd really see if you're out there observing the sky. Halloween night, that is a week from Saturday, the 31st. Down at 6, nice and dark by about 7:30 or so. So the brightest thing you're going to see looking towards the west on Halloween night will be the planet Jupiter, and it's going to be close to Saturn as well. Jupiter, blazing bright, -2 magnitude, means it outshines any star in the sky. Bright because it's really big, and also because its clouds are very shiny. So Jupiter's going to be with us for another couple of months. It's going to fade away, get lost in the light of the setting sun as we get to the end of December. And that remains true also of Saturn right next to it. So Saturn will be appearing closer to Jupiter night by night, and they'll be in a close conjunction by the end of 2020. So we have that to look forward to say farewell, this lovely gathering at the end of the year of Jupiter and Saturn. So turning around, looking towards the northern sky, you should be able to pick out the Big Dipper, try to spot that. The Big Dipper, that is a North American term. The Big Dipper, as a term, goes back probably about 200 years. And different names for this starry pattern in different parts of the world. For example, I lived in England for 2 years, and they had no idea what a dipper was in England. They call it the plough there. And across the Irish Sea, in Ireland, they had a different name. They called it the Chariot of King David. One of many examples of the Irish and the English not always seeing eye to eye. Whatever you call it, it's a handy-dandy way to point to the North Star. The North Star doesn't move. It's the one star that stays in place and shows you where north is. So as long as it's dark and clear, and as long as you're north of the equator, you can always find it. It's in the Little Dipper, and the official names for these two are actually Big Bear and Little Bear. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. These were humans turned into a bear by the god Jupiter in a story from Metamorphosis, which will appear again in our show. So in between the bears is a constellation that doesn't pop out as much, but it's actually the first of our monsters we're going to show you in the nighttime sky. This is Draco the Dragon, wending its way between the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. Draco actually means dragon in Latin, so Draco the Dragon means dragon, comma, the dragon. And it was the 11th of the 12 labors of Hercules. You see it here wending near the big little bear. Hercules does not get a really brilliant constellation. It's next to Draco. He did these 12 impossible labors, and one of them is that he had to collect the golden apples of the sun. And to do that, he had to fight this dragon. So here's Hercules, and there's the dragon, looking kind of dog-like maybe. And then there's apples all over there. So he had to fight the dragon and was able to get the golden apples that formed the 11th of the 12 famous labors of Hercules. Now Draco also has got the first of our Halloweeny nebula in it. This is the Cat's Eye Nebula. So discovered by William Herschel, the great astronomer. And it looks quite a bit like a cat eye, as you see here in this view from the Hubble Space Telescope. This is a planetary nebula, so it's a nebula that is puffing, it's a star that's coming to the end of its life, puffing off the outer layers of hydrogen as it fades away. It's a fate that will await our own sun in about 5 billion years. No need to worry, it'll be a long time down the road. But in this case, the little star in the center looks like the pupil of a cat's eye. And so it's one of the Halloweeny nebulas that are up there. Cats, at least since the 17th century, have been connected to Halloween. Witches and witch huntings and witch trials really emerged big time in the late 17th century. And they wound up also being, or late 16th century. And witches were always connected with 3 things you find in the kitchen: a cauldron, a broom, and a cat. And so at least from that time onwards, from actually the 1590s, stories about witches and witch hunting and witches using broomsticks and cauldrons and having cats at their beck and call all became part of what evolved into the story of Halloween. The famous play by Shakespeare, Macbeth, catches that dawning interest in witches. So there we have the cat's eye. And not visible to the naked eye, it's 8th magnitude, so you need a good-sized telescope, like, say, the Hubble Space Telescope, to get a good view of that. That's not the only nebula, though, that has kind of Halloweeny connections. So looking towards the north, here we have the constellation of Cepheus, the king, and in Cepheus we have the Ghost Nebula. Now, as we approach the Ghost Nebula, this is not a nebula left over from one star dying. Instead, it's a giant cloud of gas and dust in which stars are being born. And I have to zoom in before you can really... So I'll stop it here for a minute, try to go ahead and see if you can get a ghost out of this. I see a couple of different ways to view the Ghost Nebula. So you can imagine here we have the head of one big ghost, and there's one arm there and another arm there. Or you could see the Ghost Nebula as a family of ghosts. So here's the big ghost, and then here we have the teenage ghost, and here we have the little baby ghost. But however you see it, not only does it sort of vaguely resemble the ghost costume the most simple costume we all ever had, right? Throwing a sheet on over our heads and then going chasing our sister Mary around our house in Worcester, Massachusetts. Not that I ever did that when I was young, but it looks like a ghost in that way, but also the transparent nature of these clouds of gas probably also suggested ghosts to people. So that's the Ghost Nebula, and that is in Cepheus. But that's not the only Ghost Nebula. In fact, right next door to this one in Cepheus, the constellation of Cassiopeia, the wife of Cepheus, also has a Ghost Nebula called, in this case, the Ghost of Cassiopeia. And here again, it may take a little bit of imagination to turn it into a ghost and a little bit of fiddling with the image to make it turn around to where it appears most ghost-like. But this also is a great cloud of gas and dust that is, if you imagine it sort of, okay, so imagine here's the cowl of the ghost, kind of a pointy little cowl like you may see in the ghost from Ghostbusters, and the face, and then the arms of the ghost. So who would have thought there'd be ghost nebulas side by side next door in Cassiopeia and in Cepheus? But there we have it. Again, the diaphanous nature of these nebula probably reminded folks of the see-through nature of how we often depict ghosts. So there's just one more ghosty nebula I wanted to show you, and for that we got to go later in the evening. We're still on Halloween night, but now we're going to go briefly to about 1:30 in the morning. The most famous, easy-to-spot constellation is rising, the constellation of Orion the Hunter. Although technically the Witch Head Nebula, that's the one we're going to visit, is not in Orion. It belongs to the part of the sky that belongs to Eridanus the River, another constellation that's nowhere near as eye-popping as Orion. But the Witch Head Nebula is actually very close to Orion. And this one, as you zoom on in, all of these are good examples of how our imaginations have been allowed to run riot with the nighttime sky. So take a moment. I'll turn it around. I'm going to pause it for a moment and give you a moment to try to visualize the witch's head. So I'll take a moment as I pause the image, and let's see if you can spot how you can get a witch's head, a side view of a witch's head out of this image. Let me know if you see it here. So let me draw it here. So imagine here is the forehead. There's the eye socket, the pointy nose, down here for a mouth, and then an equally pointy chin. And a little bit of an outline might also help with that. So witches largely evolved out of the witch scares of the late 16th, 17th centuries, and have very much become part of our Halloween tradition now, of course. So all these different scary things from different areas have all been coalesced together into our celebration of Halloween. All right, so that's it for 4 nebulae that all seem to have connections there. Now also there's 2 more monsters in the sky to show you, going back to Cassiopeia and her husband Cepheus. They're the 2 constellations that have the 2 totally separate ghost nebulas. So Cassiopeia, in her vanity, bragged about her beauty to the gods, and Neptune, the god of the sea, punished her by making a monster called Cetus. So this monster, this way of viewing Cetus, makes it look really friendly, like a whale. And in fact, Cetus also gives its name to cetology, the actual scientific study of whales and dolphins. But to see it as a monster, you have to kind of imagine it the other way, with the head being on the left. So Cetus here goes and makes a wreckage out of the land of Cassiopeia. She asks the oracle how to stop the monster, and the oracle says she has to sacrifice her daughter Andromeda to the sea monster. So here's Andromeda, a maiden so ravishing that Perseus, as we'll hear, fell in love the moment he saw her. But her stick figure doesn't do her justice. There she is, shackled to a rock by the sea, with Cetus, the monster, getting closer and closer. Now, Perseus also doesn't do that well in the sticky figure beauty competition, but he was a great hero. And he was sent off on what appeared to be a very, very dangerous mission of getting the head of the monster Medusa. So if you look at Perseus here, you can see the head of the Medusa. There's her snakes that she has for hair. And her gaze was so ferocious that it would turn you to stone if you looked at her. So fortunately, Perseus had friends in high places. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, said, use your shiny shield to gaze at the Medusa and avoid her direct gaze, because he'll be turned to stone if you look at her. And then Mercury, the messenger god, gave him winged sandals to allow him to fly to fight the Medusa, and also gave him a bag of cool gadgets. So he goes off, Perseus does, and fights the Medusa, follows the advice, looks at her reflection in his shield, by so doing avoids the gaze of the Medusa, chops off her head, and some blood falls from the head of Medusa, hits the Mediterranean, and who knew that that recipe of Medusa blood and Mediterranean salt water is how you create Pegasus, the flying horse. So So Pegasus goes flying off because Perseus doesn't need a flying horse. He's the only person who ever lived who doesn't need a flying horse. He has winged sandals already. So he goes winging back towards Greece, flies over Ethiopia, and sees Andromeda shackled to a rock with Cetus getting closer. So here's an actual vase from 2,500 years ago that shows the monster Cetus here, and Andromeda, and Perseus in the middle, even showing you his winged sandals. So sometimes you wonder how ancient these ancient tales are, but here you have it portrayed on a vase from 2,500 years ago. Notice the boar-like appearance of Cetus. Notice also the cool bag that Mercury gave Perseus. So in the bag is the head of Medusa, and even in death it has the power to turn to stone. So Perseus holds up the head of Medusa, and the monster turns to stone, and then Perseus marries Andromeda, and they live happily for many years. So you have two monsters in this one, both the Cetus, now turned to stone, and the head of Medusa. And I imagine some of you have seen Clash of the Titans, the 2010 movie that made $750 million. That's how I know some of you may have actually seen it. In this version, they use a Norse monster called the Kraken as the name for the monster, but it basically is the Cetus with just a different name. Anyway, it's a good retelling of the story, which in the version I told you comes from the Metamorphosis of Ovid. So that's like 3 monsters in the sky and 4 ghostly nebula. But now let's talk about some other real things you can see. You can see the planet Mars. Mars is shining very brightly, and on Halloween night it'll be just as bright rising in the east as Jupiter is setting in the west. So you can actually compare Mars and Jupiter, dueling brilliant planets at -2 magnitude. But what you're going to really notice, much more so than Mars, is that full moon that is shining away as it rises here mid-evening on Halloween night. We have a full moon on Halloween night. Now that may surprise some of you that may expect that we always have a full moon on Halloween, because it sure seems like full moons and Halloweens go together, right? So every picture I've ever seen of Halloween's got a full moon in the background. But as luck would have it, because Halloween happens on the same day every year, on the 31st of October, it's a sheer coincidence if you're lucky enough to get a full moon on Halloween. In fact, the odds are one Halloween in 30 you'll have a full moon. In fact, this will be the first full moon on Halloween since 2001, and will be the last full moon on Halloween until the mid-2030s. So enjoy it while you can. The full moon on Halloween will be there all night long to light your way. My first Halloween, I had a full moon, and I thought that was the greatest thing. Like going off daylight saving time was another great thing, and it turns out that that full moon was just a total coincidence. But, of course, many of the iconic elements of Halloween have to do with full moons. And so the legend of the werewolf, for example, the idea of a man bitten by a wolf or by a werewolf who then turns into a wolf by the light of the full moon, is everywhere in our culture. It's really caught on in so many aspects of popular culture. The story, like so many stories, goes back to Ovid. So Lycaon was a man who had Jupiter come in disguise. So Jupiter came in disguise, and Lycaon tried to feed him human flesh. And Jupiter was so angry at that he turned Lycaon into a wolf, making him the first of a long, 2 millennia long string of werewolves and wolfmen. But as is often the case, Hollywood has given new life to ancient legends, as with the Perseus Andromeda story. So in terms of Hollywood's golden age, probably the best of the werewolf movies is called The Wolfman, 1941. Lon Chaney plays the Wolfman. Claude Rains plays his father. And a lot of the things that we think about as being standard issue for Wolfman stories, like turning to a wolf during the full moon, or how silver is the only thing that can stop a werewolf. A lot of folks use the term silver bullet for a magic solution to something without knowing that that comes from how you're supposed to stop a wolfman or a werewolf. The first Hollywood film about werewolves. Actually, it was called Werewolf of London from 1935. And that's not as well known as the Wolfman, but it actually gave the title to one of Warren Zevon's most famous songs, Werewolf of London. So it's lived on in music as well as in Hollywood. And also, of course, werewolves are there on television. I didn't know this, maybe call me naive or thick. I didn't know until recently that Eddie Munster, the youngest of the Munsters, is supposed to be a werewolf. And of course, recently, werewolves have really come into their own again with the Twilight Saga, where our heroine is torn between the vampire boyfriend and the werewolf boyfriend. So werewolves are not gone away. They're clearly one of the most compelling monsters in our history, and are connected with the full moon and with Halloween. So of course it's easy to assume you're going to always get a full moon on Halloween, but not going to be the case. And here's one more thing about this full moon on Halloween. I'm going to exaggerate this and make the moon really small, because the Halloween full moon will be the smallest full moon of the year. So you probably have heard of a super full moon, which occurs when the moon is a little closer than normal in its monthly path around the Earth. Well, if you have those, you've got to have mini full moons as well, that are full moons that occur when the moon is a little further than normal in its monthly path around the Earth. And that will be the case on Halloween. It'll be the smallest full moon of the year, but you probably won't be able to tell it's any smaller than a normal full moon. But check that out if you're out on Halloween. See if you can tell that the moon is a little bit smaller than your average full moon. It's also a blue moon, but that's just automatic. When you have a full moon on Halloween, it will always be a blue moon. A blue moon is a term for the second full moon in the same month. Now, full moons are about 29 and a half days apart, so it doesn't happen that often. But if you have one at the end of October 31, you've got to have one on the first day. So this will be a blue moon, as well as a mini moon, as well as the first Halloween full moon in 19 years. So enjoy it while you can. It'll be about a 15-year wait until it happens again. All right, so we're going to be talking a bit about, now that we're done with this, the moon. If you look at the moon on Halloween night and just go to the left, maybe 2 fists, you'll see a little tiny cluster of stars next to that full moon. And that cluster of stars has got a lot of significance for many cultures, including being the marker for the holiday that turned into Halloween. And it's just odd because it's little. It's hard to see if you have any kind of light pollution. With this full moon, it's going to be hard to see this little cluster of stars. But they got a great PR agent. Everyone loves the Pleiades, they're so-called. And a good example about how they are loved around the world is, of course, over in Japan, they call the Pleiades Subaru and named their car after this cluster of stars in the sky. And in fact, if you go to when in Tokyo, I highly recommend the Tokyo Edo Museum. Whole museum, beautifully done museum about the history of Tokyo. And in there you can see the first Subaru car ever made, 1958. And here on the front of that first ever Subaru, you can see a picture of the Pleiades as the logo. And that has remained their logo ever since. The Japanese also gave the name Subaru to a great telescope in Hawaii, a Japanese national telescope on the big island of Hawaii. So the Pleiades are a small cluster of stars all born together from the same cloud of gas. They're often called the Seven Sisters, although generally most folks can only see 6 unless they have amazingly good vision. And in fact, the Subaru logo only shows 6, not 7. We can see the leftover strains of gas from which the stars were born. They were born from a large nebula, like one of those ghost nebulas, but then their wind of these baby stars has blown away most of the gas from which they were born. And they will also travel through space for all time together because they're all born from the same cloud of gas. All right, so that is the Subaru coming up in the early evening here on Halloween night. And again, many names around the world. So before we go to Ireland and talk about their use of the Pleiades, before I moved here, I lived in Hawaii for 20 years. And the Hawaiian term for this little cluster of stars is today the Makali'i, which means the little eyes. a lovely term, and they're rising at sunset, which means that they're overhead at midnight. To this very day is the marker for the Hawaiian New Year. So very important in Hawaiian culture. So that day when they rise at sunset and are overhead at midnight, you go to that date, which now is November 17 in Hawaii. You wait for the first sliver of a visible moon after the new moon, and that begins the new year in Hawaiian culture. But the Hawaiians weren't the only culture that set their new year by the Pleiades. So another island culture called Ireland also marked the beginning of the year by the rising of this little star cluster. So they had a festival called Samhain, spelled Samhain, so you may think you pronounce it Samhain, but Samhain, or Samhain is how they pronounce it. And their most important day in their calendar was October 31, which was also a day when all the souls of those who had died were collected and brought down to the underworld. More of that in a moment. So here you have a date in the middle of a season. And that was a time that mattered to the Irish. It was a time when the winter was just beginning to really come on. It was a time to bring the cattle out of the pastures for wintering. It was a time for the final harvest. So September 21, the first day of fall, would have been too early. December 21, the first day of winter, is too late. They needed to have a holiday in the middle of the fall. And the sun is not a good marker if you're trying to mark off your holidays in the middle of a season. And of course, back 2,000 years ago, you had to rely upon celestial markers to mark off your calendar. So the sun rises due east on the first day of fall. The sun rises at its southernmost point on the eastern horizon on the first day of winter. But it's hard to use the sun to kind of mark off a date in the middle of a season. So what do? You use the stars. The stars come back at the same time every year. So when the Pleiades rise at sunset and are overhead at midnight, that always occurred on October 31 in Ireland, say 1,500 years ago, and the Pleiades became the marker for how they set Samhain, which evolved into Halloween. So let's go do a little bit more exploring, leaping off of our beloved New Jersey and heading over to the Emerald Isle of Ireland. Ireland really is green. Rains there quite a bit. We're going to go to here, just north of Dublin, to Ward Hill in County Meath, which was central to these ancient Irish ceremonies that would eventually become Halloween. Pulling away, we'll get a nice view back towards home sweet home. There's Long Island, so Liberty Science Center right about there. And coming into view as we go across the Atlantic, we'll see Ireland coming into view. Now, there's a reason why Ireland is called the Emerald Isle. It does rain there a lot. We see clouds over Ireland as we come into the Hill of Ward in County Meath. I was living in Seattle, and they decided to name Seattle the Emerald City. Green for the same reason as the Emerald Isle is green. Rains quite a bit in both places. So here on this hill in County Meath, this hill was used for ceremonies for Samhain, for this basically Day of the Dead ceremony of the Irish 1,000 years ago or so. It's not a really big hill. It's not a really hilly part of Ireland. But on this hill, they would observe the rising of the Pleiades and mark its passage at the very top of the sky at midnight. So let's talk a little bit about what it would be like if you were in Ireland, say, 1,500 years ago on Samhain night. So it gets dark here. Bonfires are being lit across the land. Hearth fires are also there. And rising, shortly after sunset, you have the Pleiades coming up. But during this night of Samhain, as the Pleiades rose higher and higher, all of the bonfires and hearth fires in the land would be extinguished. Now, to this day, the nighttime sky in Ireland is really, really dark. It's a beautiful sight. So imagine what it would be like to be there 1,500 years ago before electric lights, where you put out all your bonfires and the land is in total darkness at midnight on Samhain night. So the reason why that is extra unnerving is that this was the Day of the Dead as well. So on this night, the souls of everybody who had died that year were collected and brought down to the underworld. They passed into the underworld in a place in Western Ireland called the Hell Gate of Ireland. So here folks had their dearly departed relatives, their souls wandering the land as they were going to be taken down that night to the underworld. So you may want to leave out nuts, apples, other treats for your relatives who are about to take the journey down to the underworld. So here are folks putting out treats on the night of October 31. Now also, as they were being brought down to the underworld, the great stone that led to the underworld, to the Hell Gate, was opened. So all of these creatures also would come out and wander the land. So you had goblins who were wandering the land on October 31 here in ancient Ireland, and monsters. And they would have what were called, these goblins would come and take babies from households and leave in place a goblin that looked just like a baby. But as the legend goes, this changeling, that's what they called it, was supernaturally cunning, wicked beyond their years, and here's what really gets me, very skilled in music. So you have sort of playful goblins wandering around. You also had sort of more evil spirits wandering the land. And there's one day when, at midnight, all the lights were extinguished across Ireland. Some folks, fearing the goblins, would disguise themselves, cover their faces in dirt to try to hide themselves from the monsters wandering the land here. So here you got folks kind of disguising themselves, making themselves look kind of scary themselves, leaving treats out for their souls of their dearly departed. A lot of things going on here in Ireland long ago, say 1,500 years ago, that would have reemerged in Halloween. So there you are. The land is in pitch darkness. It's now midnight. And then as the Pleiades here, let me show you where they are. As the Pleiades go down the sky, then they will slowly begin to rekindle the lights in the land. So they will use a giant stone wheel on this hill of Ward to start one fire by friction. And then torches would bring all the fires to the hearths and the bonfires across the land. So by the dawn on November 1, Ireland would be back to normal, to begin another year and to buckle down for the coming of the cold season. So also another legend that involves Samhain night, the Irish tell, is that there were these really evil creatures called the Fomor. These were sea monsters who long ago, in the before times, ruled over Ireland. And they would come every year and demand a tax of 1/3 of all the milk, of 1/3 of all the wheat, and 1/3 of all the children. And then fortunately, the good guys eventually came along, called the Tuatha, and defeated the Fomor on Samhain night and locked them away, again behind that Hell Gate of Ireland. But guess what night they got out to go and wander the land again? Sure enough, Samhain night, you also had these Fomor, along with the more fun-spirited goblins and other souls wandering the land. So a lot of these traditions from 2,000 years ago, not only from Ireland, but also from Scotland and Wales, got brought over to the New World with the great immigration in the 19th century. So one thing here is also the fact that bonfires, a big part of Samhain, used to be a big part of American Halloween. That's kind of died out now, but as recently as 75 years ago, lighting bonfires was a really big deal in America for Halloween. There's actually, oddly enough, a movie called Meet Me in St. Louis, Judy Garland movie from 1944 that depicts Halloween in 1903 St. Louis, and they have bonfires as a big part of the ceremony. And that also, it's a really interesting film, really shows you that trick-or-treating was much more nasty back in the early 20th century. So Margaret O'Brien, who plays the little sister of Judy Garland, would go knocking on doors, and when someone comes, instead of saying trick-or-treat, she would throw flour in their faces and say, "I hate you," and run away. And the parents would just kind of laugh and go, "Oh yeah, it's Halloween. That's what kids do." So Halloween's gotten a little more mellow, I guess, since those days. And bonfires have not been as much a part of our lore. But certainly disguising yourself and going about on Halloween dressed as monsters, that's a huge part of this holiday, obviously, nowadays. And also the idea that you go and beg for treats on doorsteps and such. So a lot of these Halloween traditions have, in fact, were established in Ireland and Scotland, were brought to America in the 19th century. Then we brought them back or exported them back to Ireland. It wasn't a big holiday in Ireland 100 years ago. Nowadays, I think it's more common. Here's an Irish Halloween shop with the costumes all laid out. When I lived in England, you might have one more drink in the pub, but it wasn't really a big day when I was living there. I think we've exported our beloved and really quite engaging holiday back to Europe now. So I've often said that really the most well-known Irish holiday in America is not St. Patrick's Day. It's actually Halloween. And I'm going to end with one more example of that. The jack-o'-lantern we also got from the Irish. And there are many stories about how this ne'er-do-well Jack actually wound up having to have a lantern. So nowadays, jack-o'-lanterns carved of pumpkins can be charming. They can be scary. But one thing is assured, when we carve them here in the United States, we make them out of pumpkins. But you probably know they don't have pumpkins in Ireland. So in the story of Jack basically tricked the devil into promising that the devil would never let Jack into hell. He basically had the devil go up a tree to get some apples, and when the devil was up there, Jack laid some crosses on the ground so the devil couldn't get down. And he said, okay, devil, I'll let you down only if you promise never to let me into hell. So the devil said, okay, let me down. So Jack has a ne'er-do-well life, dies, goes to the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, I'm not going to let you into heaven. You've been bad your entire life. So Jack was stuck between heaven and hell, allowed in neither place. So to light his way as he wandered through eternity, he carved the first jack-o'-lantern. But since they didn't have pumpkins in Ireland, he instead carved the first jack-o'-lantern out of a turnip. So yes, indeed, the first turnips were made, jack-o'-lanterns emerged here in Ireland. There's actually these great little museums you can see, turnip jack-o'-lanterns to this day in Ireland. And they actually have a pretty kind of Halloween-y, scary feel to them as well. But when the Irish came to the New World, they realized pretty quickly that jack-o'-lanterns made a lot more sense if you carve them out of pumpkins. One last footnote is actually pumpkins being carved was a tradition by the late 19th century in America. So the legend of Sleepy Hollow has got nothing to do with Halloween, but pumpkins and jack-o'-lanterns are part of that story. But eventually all these different threads, the witches and the dressing up and the scary creatures and the jack-o'-lanterns and the werewolves all came together to coalesce into this modern-day holiday of Halloween. So when you go out trick-or-treating, or if you just look at the moon on Halloween night, it's good to contemplate the fact that so many different strands from different places involving astronomy and involving mythology all came together to generate what for many people I think is their favorite holiday of the entire year. So that is our program. Thank you for joining us. That's the formal end. I'll stay around for a few minutes to see if there are any more questions. Again, if you want to support us, that donate button is there. The purple donate button is a way that will allow us to keep on doing these programs. And next week, the Thursday show is going to be Krista talking about the moon just in time for that mini moon, blue moon, full moon that will be happening on Halloween night. Thank you again, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And we'll just check out and see if we have any, good to see it. Someone is deciding to try to make a turn-up jack-o'-lantern. Yes, indeed. That is definitely something you can try doing. Because they decay pretty quickly, they don't last very long. Pumpkins last a long time, right? But they have a really kind of a nice, eerie feeling there. And, yes, goblins there. Yes, Warren Zevon. So now I wanted to mention also, of course, Warren Zevon's song, Werewolves of London, one of his biggest hits. Also, American Werewolf in London is another great movie from the early 80s, I think it is, that also builds in a very humorous way upon the werewolf. It's also a very gory movie, though, so I wouldn't show it if you have very little children. But it is a really playful movie that makes that builds very nicely on a lot of these tropes about werewolves. Checking out anything else here to see if any more questions. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Martha, for your kind comments about our programming. Oh, Belmar's wondering, do they also use potatoes? I would imagine that may have been later, but the potato also is a New World creation, right? So potatoes came later to Ireland than the heyday of Celtic times. The potato got established and then became the staple for the Irish by the 19th century. And then around 1845, 1846, the catastrophic potato famine is what drove millions of Irish to America. Pumpkins don't last a long time if you have squirrels. Yeah, nothing lasts a long time if you have squirrels around. All right, so don't see any other questions there in the chat, so I'm really hoping that you all can join us next week when Krista will be talking about the moon and double moon, full moon coming up here on Halloween night. We will be doing the program in November as well. We're kind of working out the actual topics for that, so stay tuned for information on that shortly. And thank you again for joining us for Liberty Science Center Planetarium Online.